Our guest on ANN is Edwin Shuker. He's an Iraqi Jew and a board member of the Board of British Jews. Welcome to ANN Satellite Television. Good to have you with us again. Our guest today is Edwin Shuker. Edwin is an Iraqi-born member of the Jewish community here in Britain. Edwin is actually vice president of the European Jewish Congress, which is a lead organization for the Jewish community in 42 nations. But more than that, as far as we here in Britain are concerned, he is a member of the 9-member executive committee of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, which is the key Jewish organization here in Britain and the lead organization as far as the Jewish community is concerned. So Edwin, it's a privilege to have him with us, and we will be discussing 3 issues. We're discussing Iraq today. Obviously, Edwin, as born in Iraq, really feels strongly about the way Iraq is today. We'll be discussing the whole issue of anti-Semitism and the issue of the Islam and the Jewish community post-Paris. We know that we live in a new world. The whole issue of the Paris catastrophe, or call it what you will, has reshaped our thinking. So we want to discuss this issue. We also intend to discuss the role of the Jewish community, particularly the Jewish community from the Arab world, in the Middle East peace process, and this is itself interesting. But before we do, we're going to go to a short video clip as is our custom, so we'll do that now. Thank you. The absence of a political process to accompany the airstrikes is driving Sunni communities to ally more strongly with ISIS, especially in sensitive areas around Baghdad. Iraq's Vice President for Reconciliation, Iyad Alawi, said the lack of a political process between the Shias who dominate the country's power base and disenfranchised Sunnis was a grave mistake that could mean the air attacks end up achieving little. The world is growing more polarized after recent events in Paris. Germany has a growing anti-Islamic protest movement. It's called Pegida, which stands for Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamization of the West. They are accused of misusing the events in France to further their cause. Its surge in popularity has shocked established political parties and comes at a time in which concerns over immigration are polarizing that country. But there are fears that the attacks in Paris have crystallized the cause of the right, not just in Germany, but everywhere in the West. There is a role for the Jews from the Arab states in the Middle East peace process today. Oriental, Sephardic peace movements, from the Black Panthers of the 70s to the new Rainbow Coalition of Mizrahi groups in Israel, not only call for a just peace for Israelis and Palestinians, but also for the cultural, political, and economic integration of Israel and Palestine into the Middle East. Edwin, it's really good. Thank you for being with us here on ANN. I want to start, we want to start by talking about Iraq. You're an Iraqi, basically. It is your homeland. You were born there, and you were brought up in Iraq. That's right.
I was. Actually, for 2,600 years I've been Iraqi.
Yes,
So
the Jewish community.
The Jewish community is the oldest community in the world that lived in the diaspora and kept its identity and loyalty to its birthplace, to Iraq. So I'm privileged to speak about the subject and ask what you want. What would you like to know?
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, I mean, you just tell me first. You were there till how old were you when you came to Britain?
I grew up there. I almost finished school. I was 16 plus when I managed to escape Iraq in 1971. That was after the Saddam Hussein came to power in 1968. And we came here as asylum seekers, and we've been welcomed in this hospitable country, and very grateful for that.
Oh, good. And you go back. Since 2003, since the fall of Saddam, you have been traveling back to Iraq.
I do, and I will always do, because I do not want to lose that connection after so many years, and after so many generations of Jews being in Iraq and being part of shaping Iraq. I want to carry on as long as I am alive, as long as it's under my watch. And I want to tell my kids and my grandchildren where their source is.
And obviously there is, I mean, without going into details, but there is a tiny Jewish community left, even to this day, in Iraq.
There is a tiny Jewish community, but we still have 6 biblical shrines there. The cemetery where my grandparents were buried, the school that we went to, the synagogues, it's still there.
And the synagogue is still functioning. So
there is one synagogue that's functioning, but the others, there's 54 synagogues in Baghdad alone.
Wow, really?
Yes. It's a glorious community that in the 40s were 150,000 plus.
Wow, my goodness, I had no idea. So this is very much part of your life, part of your blood, but Iraq today has fallen apart. I mean, we're living in a it's become a catastrophe. It's hard to say who's to blame. Saddam bears a major proportion of the blame. We, post the liberation of Iraq, we handled things badly, I guess. Where are we now? We see Iraq effectively split into 3 parts, don't we? I mean, you have ISIS controlling one section, or what we call ISIS, the Arabs call Daesh. It controls one section, the Kurds control another, and the Shiites control a third. So 3 nations in one, is that right?
Those of us who dreamt in 2003 of a renewal of this glorious Iraq as a united country, within it you had a myriad of communities, of religions, of Assyrians and Kildanis and Christians and Armenians and Sunnis and Shias and Jews. We all lived, as far as I can remember, we all lived like neighbors, like no one ever questioned at the time who is who and what is what. I still don't know whether our neighbors were Sunnis or Shiites or Christians. We just were Iraqis. So we all had dreams in 2003 and 2000, and then these dreams were translated into nightmares at the end. What will happen in the next few years? It's everybody's guess. But I want to tell you that I feel today there are the pangs of a birth of a new state, whether it's going to be a 3-part one or whether it's going to be federal or whether we united, we'll see. But there is a kind of recently, since the change of government, there has been a quietening down in the terms of the security, in terms of the killing, and in terms of a realization that Iraq has sunk so much down that it's time to start thinking, as where do we go from here and how do we damage limit.
Do you have hope for Haider al-Abadi's government, the new government in Iraq?
So far, it has been receiving much better reception from the population. The security system is better. The opening to hear the others, the Sunni triangle, the Kurds, whether that is realization because of fatigue, because of fighting fatigue and killing fatigue, or whether it is a new way of looking at Iraq. In any way, it is much more optimistic I am than I was under the previous regime, the previous government.
And yet you have all these foreign powers who take an interest. Every neighbor of Iraq, from Turkey to Saudi Arabia to Iran to Kuwait to Jordan, they're all, some of them obviously are what's the word, benign. They are not meddling in a major way, but many of them are.
Sometimes you feel like the vultures circling a body, for sure.
Yes,
when I go there, that's for sure. But there is a kind of, this, what happened with the ISIS and the Daesh has waken up a lot of people to what could we be heading unless we really sit and bring common sense to our lives. And that's not just in Iraq, that's across the Middle East and even across the world. When one sees what's happening, one realizes that you cannot sit on the fence anymore. And they say that the brightest time of the day comes in after the darkest hours of the night. And I certainly feel that we've gone through the darkest hours of the night in the last few months.
Because Daesh are really a new phenomenon. They are, I mean, we used to have this concept in Islam of the people of the book, where you would respect your other people of other religious persuasion, particularly the Christians and Jews, and that was great. That was a wonderful concept, and we had one world family of religions. The Daesh seems to divide the world into Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb, the world of Islam and the world of war, and you're not with us, you're against us, and their definition of Islam is very narrow. So you have, in effect, a kind of Puritan group that is more extreme than even Al-Qaeda, from which it evolved. It's really radical. But Iraq is its birthplace. Iraq has created this. I mean, in a sense, it's Iraq.
Well, the conditions that were fermenting after 10 years of the previous government, or, so however years, that conditions actually produced.
You mean of Saddam?
No, I meant of the...
Of Maliki, you mean?
Of Maliki.
I see, since 2003 to 2013.
Yes, I do think, unfortunately, that sectarian attitude towards the, say, the former officers of the Iraqi army, the Sunni triangle, they were mismanaged.
But can you blame entirely Maliki? I mean, the whole business of those de-Baathification laws, for example, were put in by Bremer. I mean, it was law number 1, wasn't it? And they have been, Maliki may have kept them in place, but it was us that established them. I mean, us, the Allies, responsible for much of Iraq's misery, because there's this, whether it's a reality or not, but there's this sense that they target the Sunni community. And
it depends how far you carry out what the initial ideas were. I think the initial ideas were copied from what happened after World War II. You couldn't have senior Nazi people running the place anymore. However, it depends. If it carries on for decades and it actually uproot people who actually were in government or in army serving Iraq and target them, it could pass on the dividing between what is sensible and common sense and what is actually revenge tactics. And also, it was used, actually, forget about Sunnis and Shias, it was used to remove people who were competing with you on commerce or on a contract or something like that. I mean, I sat in meetings whereby a competitor would say, well, can we find out something about the other side? Were they in government, were they in the army, just anything. And really that was the seeds of the destruction of the unity. Well, what do you do if you were an officer of the Iraqi army and you've been generations as officer, and now you're sitting in your little village in sandals? You cannot work, you cannot have your dignity, you cannot look at... What are you going to do?
You're going to fight, yes.
You're going to fight.
Exactly.
You're going to fight out of total frustration and also out of remembering that this is so unfair. You actually, at the end of the day, you were serving your country. You were not choosing sides.
The other thing I wonder is that our policy, I know we have to bomb, but there's so much collateral damage. Even now, when we attack ISIS, we attack these towns and to drive ISIS out, and then they're amongst the civilian population. I mean, they have a lot of support from the reality is because of this resentment of and this sectarianism that has evolved.
My news from the ground is that these are totally ineffective way of dealing with the ISIS.
This bombing. Yeah.
Yes, totally. And I'm talking about the news that I'm picking up from yesterday and last week and the week before. There's a quietness at the moment. There is no pressure on ISIS to do anything. And then you have heard recently that they had a couple of raids against the Peshmerga. They don't seem to be affected. And then, as you said, on the contrary, it seems that these sorties are sometimes counterproductive than actually going anywhere. And I think the strategist always knew that you really cannot run a campaign and you cannot get rid of this phenomena through a couple of sorties a day, looking for, what are you looking for? I mean, at the end of the day, at the moment, they are embedded into the running of the Mosul and Fallujah and all these places. So what does the sortie look for? I mean,
So what do we do? I mean, do we somehow accommodate the status quo and learn to live with these people? Or do we, what do we do? How do we deal with Iraq?
I think the beginning of how to deal with it is already starting. If you keep abreast of what's happening now, there's talk now of having a major conference, reconciliation conference in Baghdad that includes the Sunnis and the Kurds with the government, with the Shiite representative, and I even heard recently that they were going to re-examine this de-Ba'athization process to see how far can they go with it.
They have to get rid of it, surely. I mean,
well, that's what was hinted by no less than Al-Hakim when he said that they have to really review it. And I think that would be probably the beginning of looking at Iraq post the 2003
yes.
in an intelligent way, in a way far from revenge and picking up on previous animosity and starting to say, right, we are all in it here. We've seen what the worst part of it. We've seen what we can go down to. Let's now sit down and...
and you would say sit down with ISIS even?
No. I think my view, ISIS in Iraq only exists because it is allowed to exist. And I think, quite honestly, once a proper reconciliation is done with the Arabic tribes near the areas of Mosul, near the disputed areas with the Kurds, as long as you solve that, then I think ISIS will disappear in front of your very eyes. And I think you will not even know they were there once the reconciliation is there. They'll just melt into the crowd. At the end of the day, they're not tens of thousands. The hardcore that came from Syria are in hundreds. I mean, how can hundreds control Iraq or control the third?
Well, I mean, more than hundreds, because you have all the foreign volunteers, don't you? And so
no, I think the hardcore, the ones that have to be pushed back or wiped out or whatever, are no more than the few hundreds. Once you take away the thousands who joined them from the local, the local population, and once that is settled, and once the local population say to them, "Sorry guys, your time is up. Enough is enough. You either get out of here alive or you won't be around." And I think that will come very swiftly once the agreement is there.
So you have some sense of hope about Iraq at least in the mid to long term. You can.
I do. I think we are over the worst, and of course, when saying that, I'm very conscious about the hundreds of thousands of refugees who are right now suffering like nobody's in the Western world is covering properly. I have talked to my Yazidi friends last night. They are sitting in summer tents that are so thin, like the ones you take for a scout picnic, and they are now looking at a winter in the mountains of Kurdistan. People will be dying and are dying left, right, and center. And I think the world got bored of this story. They covered it. It's now it's done.
Syrian refugees.
It's gone now. Syrian refugees. It's the same. The Western world picks on a story, milks it to death for a few days, and then let's move on to the next one. And I think that I'm not optimistic about their plight, but I'm optimistic about the final political solution in Iraq.
Well, that's a kind of a positive note. Let's move to the second issue we want to discuss, which is more international, but it runs on very clearly from Iraq, because we've been talking about Islamic extremism, and I shouldn't use this phrase Islamic extremism. I should use the phrase Muslim extremism. I've been told often enough that Islam is the religion and the Muslim, it's like a car and a driver. Islam's the religion, the Muslim is the driver, and you can't have extreme Islam. Islam is a faith. You can have an extreme Muslim. And what we're seeing is very extreme Muslims who are coming out of this crucible in the Middle East and infecting this. I mean, we see this thing in Paris. I know it's the world moves on and the world has moved on, but it's indicative of a tension between communities that is really distressing. I mean, we don't have a successful culture here in Europe when we're fragmented and we have our minorities, elements of our key Muslim minority feel resentful of the lives they face. And then you have the byproduct anti-Semitism and so on, which has been with us a long time but comes back. I mean, it is very distressing, this new European world we're seeing.
It certainly is. For me as Vice President of the European Jewish Congress, I am extremely aware of the impact of Paris on all our communities, bar none. If they manage to succeed, these terrorists, is to sow the fear and the terror in hearts much bigger and much more important than actually a few people that they kill. Today, what can I tell you? Almost many countries in Europe, when the father and mother sends their kids to school, they are worried like they have not done for decades and decades and decades. And this is in the heart of Europe. We had instances in Brussels and in Antwerp and in Amsterdam where over minutes you get a call from the security apparatus saying, close the school, get everybody out. And this is today happening in 2015 in Europe, to actually get a call, send all your kids back home. It is very, very distressing. And however, even here I see light, and I have a certain optimism. I always try and find the opportunity in the challenge itself. And I think the Muslim communities across Europe and probably across the world are realizing today the seeds that were sown in the last few decades of extreme radicalism that has brought up a way that a young man, a young French man who's got his whole life open to him, thinks nothing but to actually go out, take a machine gun, kill 12 journalists, and then feel justified and proud to kill himself as well.
Yeah, and so it's not, but it's not just one man. I mean, if it was one man, one lone incident, it would be one thing. We're seeing incidents of this kind happening, and we've seen them since 9/11. I mean, we've seen them again in Britain. We had our own problems here, the tube bombings and so on. But it's coming back. The Rigby killing of Rigby, the soldier. It's not one lone incident. Lee Rigby, bless his poor heart, died. Just an innocent man was killed. And we get these things, the Charlie Hebdo guys. Whatever you think of, there's a different issue, by the way, with regard to the cartoons they were drawing. They may be distasteful and disrespectful, but the issue that people want to kill in revenge for this, there's something wrong with our society. We are marginalizing, somehow we're marginalizing our minorities. And there is this, it's not just some sense of driving for greater Islamic hegemony in the world. It is actually a sense of people feeling marginalized, people feeling not part of France or Britain, and wanting to somehow take vengeance and take it. In a way, I think they're seeking a lot of these people are finding refuge in a kind of Salafism, which is going back to basics, search for purity as they see it. And I'm not talking about sexual purity. It's some sort of anti-materialism. They want to reject the Western world, which has not given them anything.
William, I don't agree with you that we should be blaming ourselves for causing that. I think the responsibility should be taken over by the Muslim communities themselves. We, the Jewish community and the Christian community, I'm sure, have our own fundamentalists, have our own strong heads, our own mad people, our own fanatics.
Do, clearly.
But we deal with it. And we deal with it without blaming anybody else. We say, sorry, not in my name. Sorry, you do not practice this in my school. You do not say this in that. There are laws, and within socially as well. It's not acceptable for me in my home that my son would come up with some Islamophobic statement. I will stop that. And I think that we should take the responsibility to the, and I think they are taking, this is the way my optimism comes from. I think this speech that Al-Sisi made at the Al-Azhar a few weeks ago is a fundamental landmark in the story of the Islamic radicalization. I think here's a brave man standing, Al-Sisi, standing Al-Azhar in front of the Grand Mufti Al-Azhar instead of all the Imams, and taking the responsibility and saying, guys, we cannot be fighting the whole world. The Islamic authorities have to review what we are doing and what we are teaching, have to even review the text that came out, subsequent to the Quran and subsequent to the Hadith in the recent hundreds of years that came out, and review them. And perhaps we need a revolution that will redefine these texts and bring them to what life in the 21st century means. After all, we had we had the Crusaders, we had atrocities unbounded.
Well, yes.
But at some stage, society takes control and responsibility and says, enough is enough. We are not going to tolerate you taking on the name of God, on the name of religion, and kill people left, right, and center in defense of the Prophet or in defense of ideology. We will not allow that to happen. And the Christian world, the European world, has taken on that. And you cannot today stand up and says, right, I'm homophobic, he's a homosexual, I'm going to go and kill him. You cannot say that today. You try and say anything close to that in the newspapers or on the radio or something, and you are out of it. You're out of public life.
Here in the UK, but we're in a situation where people are rejecting our Western values. I'm sorry I come back to this, but I mean, I appreciate what you say. The Sunni community particularly needs to take responsibility for its own. And because I notice here on ANN, for instance, we can interview Shiite leaders who are religious leaders. We just had, not so long ago, Yusuf Al-Khoi sitting where you're sitting and talking on behalf of the Shiite community. Much more difficult to really put a member of a religious leader from the Sunni community on the spot, and not just here on ANN, but on British television. There aren't enough Sunni Muslim leaders speaking out. I appreciate that. You're quite right, and I can understand. Well, I don't agree with, but I can understand why up to a point, because their communities feel under attack in the Middle East. People feel vulnerable, and then people are nervous, and Arabs are nervous just as we are nervous. But there's still the underlying problem. Our communities, there is something wrong. I don't know whether we have gone too much for multiculturalism or what, but somehow or other, young Muslims in the Midlands in Britain are not feeling part of British society, and that is not just down to the Sheikh of Al-Azhar pulling his weight. It's something more fundamental with the way we live here, wouldn't you say?
I think it's a matter of identity search, William. I think and when you are searching for identity in a world that you might think is passing you by, you might want to latch on an ideology that allows you to be a superstar, a hero, a martyr, without having to work too hard. Wherever you are, all you have to do, take a machine gun, blow up somebody's brain, and you're a martyr. And I think the ideology did not come from that young man himself, but from those who are teaching him. And I think that in the 60s and 70s and 80s, with the export of a certain brand of Islam, and I don't here distinguish between Shiism or Sunnism. I mean, the Iranian Revolution exported a certain ideology, and so we mustn't forget that. And I think that ideology, if I was somebody sitting today in I don't know, Leicester or Birmingham or Bradford and looking for who am I in this Western world, and I then go and hear somebody giving me the keys to the paradise, and everything is fine. All you have to do is to join me and listen to me, and then all the keys are open for you. I might fall for it, and therefore I do not blame that young man. I blame the people who are actually decimating and this sort of ideology. And I think you are underestimating what the Al-Azhar and the religious powers in Saudi and the Gulf and the Qatari and the Jordanians could go together and say, we've gone too far.
It's hard though, because you have the main spokesman. I mean, love him or hate him, but the main voice of Sunni Islam surely is Qaradawi on...
I haven't heard from him for a while.
You haven't?
No. I haven't heard from him for the last few months. Have you? I don't know. I haven't said
no,
that. No. You know what? Where there is a will, and what the Western world also have to understand what the problems are, the causes and the effects.
Yes.
And it does not work. It does not work if we keep on saying, well, these are the Islam is a religion of peace, and these guys are twisting it. Full stop. Okay, so we could say that, but we cannot treat the actual problem if we keep on saying something that isn't quite true.
Take your point. Now let's move on to our third issue, which is the role of the Jews from Arab communities. We're talking about our responsibility. The Middle East peace process has got to be the responsibility at the end of the day of every fair-thinking person on this earth, but particularly of the Jewish community. We want some settlement of this. It's the core issue. Okay, the ISIS is an issue, the Iraq is an issue, Syria is an issue, Libya is an issue. But right back, the one issue that's been with us for decades and decades, and that is an issue that matters to everybody in the world, is the one of the Middle East peace process. Where do you had an interesting point. You said that there was a role for Jews from Arab countries in this Middle East peace process. Could you explain
Yes,
that?
I thank you very much for allowing me to say this, my thoughts on this subject. My thoughts are as follows. I have, as a Jew from Arab country, I have lived with Arab and with Islam for the last 1400 years. And I survived well. And my mission in life is to restore that coexistence that lasted so long and worked for most of the time, worked beautifully and produced incredible results in not just Andalusia, and not just the fine arts and science and finance, but in all aspects of the world, up to the 40s, up to the Iraq Jewish community had a golden age between the 1920s and 1940s. We're talking about people still alive who remember shaping the new Iraq. And therefore, I'm not talking here about Andalusia 1,000 years ago. I'm talking about this people alive today who remembers the language that we used to have between the two parties, the coexistence contract that was there. And today, Muslims and Jews who of a certain age and of a certain knowledge know that and appreciate that. William, 10 years ago, I wouldn't come up with to have the audacity to say that we could make a breakthrough. But I think the upheavals, whether you call it Arab Spring or Arab upheavals, have taught all of us a lot of lessons. And I see now a lot more understanding and a lot more willingness to hear me and to hear what I'm saying, that both parties, the Israelis and the Palestinians and the wider Arab region, have to go back only, I'm talking about 70 years ago, and see how the two parties lived and how they lived together. And when I say the contribution of Jews from Arab countries, I mean our knowledge of the culture and our knowledge of the unwritten contract that's made us survive for so long and so well and work so well. And I think we have to contribute, and it's not too late to contribute. It would be too late in a generation, because my son already does not know that language. But for the next couple of decades, we have a golden opportunity to restore, and we have an example of how we could live together.
But how can we do that? I mean, we have a kind of a frozen situation where people are talking about a one-state solution. I'm not just talking about Palestinians. You're getting Jews now in Israel who no longer seek a two-state solution for Israel and Palestinian problem. We are way back from where there is some energy, because we see it from the American Secretary of State, or we have done. Kerry has been pushing, but he's maybe been clumsy. He's not well received. How are we going to trigger this Middle East peace process? How are we going to move things forward? So,
William, you give me 1.5 minutes to resolve the Palestinian-Israeli issue and the Arab region, and that this is something that maybe you would bring me back again and I could expand on it. All I want to say to you is, where there is a trust, the impossible can happen. Where there is no trust, not Kerry and not Kerry's father could help at all. And what I'm suggesting is trust-building exercise. Restore that trust that the Jew and the Arab had in 70 years ago and carried on for 1400 years. Restore the trust of what your word means, what your intentions are, and once that is there, a kilometer here and a kilometer there is not going to be the hurdle, not in the 21st century, not with the high tech that we have at the moment. That is what you need, and you need that common language and common interest. At the end of the day, it does not need to be born out of sheer love. It could be common interest of coexistence. It could be that I want my children to live with your children in a better world than the one I created. And the way to do it is ABC. And therefore, you know what? I've tried everything else. I've fought for 65 years. Perhaps there's another way. And I think the language that we've developed with our, well, I mean, I always call myself Jew by religion and Arab by culture. It is my culture as well. And therefore,
yes,
that's why I say.
You spoke Arabic.
What do you mean? It's my first language. I hear Arabic. I eat Arabic. Yes. I live Arabic. And therefore,
it's an interesting point, actually,
the bridge that I could understand where everybody is coming from. I honestly understand where an Arab leader, what position he's in and what he can deliver and what he cannot deliver. And I also, being a Jew by religion and being in contact with the Israelis as well, I can understand where their fear is. At the end of the day, it's trust. And when that is established, then the rest will just fall into place.
It's very interesting, actually. Just to finish off, but the Arab world, you are an Arab, because the Arab, by definition, is a linguistic definition, isn't it? I mean, we talk about Arabs, and we're not necessarily talking about the religion. We have Christian Arabs who are throughout the Middle East, and particularly in Syria and Iraq. So Arab, technically, Arab is a linguistic division, and in that sense, you are an Arab. You hoping one day to get your Iraqi passport back?
Well, first of all, I do not want to go into semantics and definitions.
I'm wrong.
Enough to say that I'm as I said, I'm a Jew by religion.
Yeah.
I'm an Arab by culture. I'm a proud Iraqi. I'm working very hard to get the passport. and I'm been promised that it's going to be available in the next few months. I've been waiting for it for a while, and I will be inviting you to celebrate once I get it.
Well, bless you, Edwin. Thank you so much for being our guest. We're not going to lose you yet because there is one other small item we want to discuss. But
I'm going
thank
nowhere.
you.
Thank you.
So, Edwin, has been our custom to discuss a book at the end of our topic, our discussion. And today, you had a particular book that has been interesting, a book you're reading. Can you tell us a little bit about this book?
Yeah, the book is called The Promised Land by Ari Shavit, Arishavit. Ari Shavit is a well-known left-wing journalist who writes for the Haaretz in the newspaper in Israel. But he's also an intellectual, a historian, and an interesting character per se. Now, the book is, I think, first of all, it was extremely well received in America, in Europe. He won a few awards on it. And I recently went to hear him talk about it a few times. And I would recommend that book for anyone who wants to understand how Israel, this state, was established, by whom, why, what for, and that gives you the foundation for all the subsequent tension within the Israeli society, which is up to now, in terms of the European Jewry versus Oriental Jewry, or the Mizrahi, in terms of the religious as opposed to the godless, and the people who absolutely taken, do not do religion, full stop, to the causes in terms of the background of those who started the Israeli state. He takes it from the end of the 19th century in a most fascinating story he tells about his great-grandfather who visited Palestine, that area in 1880 or something like that, before Herzl and before the actual first Zionist conference and all that.
So, because for many Palestinians, of course, they talk of the Nakba, the catastrophe, rather than in terms of 48.
And no, I'm talking about him tracing it well before that. And by the time he gets to 1948, you actually understand the forces that has created the state in that piece of land, and the tension they subsequently had with other streams of the Israeli society. And of course, whether they beat the Arab population, the ones who stayed behind within the state of Israel, whether the refugees, whether the Oriental Jews, whether the religious Jews, whether the Hasidic Jews, nationalistic Jews, that tells me, opened my eyes to so much and to so many things. And as I said, he traces it from way before, well, not way, but before Herzl even started his thing. And then
I mean, it sounds fascinating. We will read it. I will read it. Your thought is that we see, just to add a little bow to the knot, as it were. I mean, Israel was established in 48, of course, without a constitution, without any defined borders. But do you believe that there should be a Palestinian state? Is that your...
Well, this is not for this conversation. Of course I believe that, but that's not what I wanted to convey. I wanted to convey something else about this book. I wanted to find out when my grandparents were displaced from Iraq. Yes. And when this glorious community of 150,000 people and 1 million Jews who lived in the Arab world, 1 million Jews lived there in the 40s. And now there's about 4,000 left in the whole of the Arab world. Now, when these people went to Israel in the early 50s, there was a lot of tension. There was a lot of trying to find a place. And for me, this was a fascinating topic to understand the roots of that. And the roots of that, I will sum it to you in a couple of minutes, is that the people who actually established the state were Europeans who were who were influenced very much by the Holocaust. They were influenced by the
were,
way
yes.
they lived with their European Christian neighbor, i.e. In ghettos and in stiebels and in fear of pogroms in the Ukraine and Russia and all that sort of thing. That's the background of those who established the state. Plus the fact that they were totally irreligious. They were totally rejected anything to do with God and the Torah and all that other thing. They identified themselves as a proud Jew, a secular one, and they called themselves even the Hebrew, not the Jew, so to distinguish the two. And that Hebrew was in government in 1950 when my grandparents arrived to the land. And the clash between a European godless Zionist who actually toiled the land and worked on every stone, and suddenly confronted with a traditional, religious, oriental, Arab-cultured community, 1 million people that came over, and that really solved for me a lot of ideological and a lot of questions, historical questions. And that's the beauty of that book for me.
Interesting. The Promised Land by
Ari Shavit.
Ari Shavit. Thank you very much. And Edwin, thank you very much for being our guest.
It's my pleasure, and please invite me again. I have more to say.
Okay, many, many thanks. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Bless you.